Hey everyone, and welcome back to 10-Minute Elections. I know it has been a while, but today's date is Saturday, the 26th of December, 2020. I attempted to record this video at first almost a week ago, at least 4 or 5 days ago, but then I found out that my software glitched right as I began the recording, and so the entire thing got scrapped, never saved to my computer. I tried a few more times over the past few days, finally tinkered with some stuff on my computer and got it to work now. So here we are. Now, I hope y'all certainly had a Merry Christmas yesterday, a Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate, just a happy holidays, a great time, however you celebrated. Today's video, I want to talk about, there's been a lot of talk about in many political circles regarding how off the polls were in 2020, and that, this may be the end of the polling industry, and, Nate Silver should retire, all sorts of stuff. And to their credit, there is some truth to this because the polling industry obviously didn't get 2016 right, and I've spoken out on the channel in defense of the polling industry in 2016 because a lot of the results were in the margins of error. That said, they called the election drastically incorrectly. A lot of the, especially less mainstream pundits, were actually the most accurate group. Their predictions were kind of split Clinton and Trump. Now, in 2020, I'd been talking in the run up to the election about how Donald Trump could potentially win, but he needed the polls to be even more wrong than they were in 2016. And they almost were. The polls were actually slightly better in 2016 than they were this year. I mean, in some areas, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Ohio, we'll get to that in a second, the polls were a disaster, where in some areas like Pennsylvania and Georgia, they actually did very well. So, let me go over my key here. The Republican and Democrat ratings are not for states that went R and D. Tilt Republican or Democrat means that the polls were off, means that there was an election day shift within 1 point, 0 to 1 points from where the polls were. So, like in Arizona, the RCP average heading into election day was Biden 0.9. The final result was 0.3. So that would be a tilt R. It shifted 0.6 points to Donald Trump. Lean is going to be 1 to 2 points. Likely is 2 to 5 points. And then safe is 5+ points, meaning bordering on, or in many cases completely outside what would be a good polls margin of error. A good polls margin of error is going to be roughly 2.5 to 3 points. So a lot of the polls, like in states such as Wisconsin, Iowa, and Ohio, were just dead wrong. Obviously, the same thing for D. Shift R little polling, again, same system, safe, likely, lean, tilt. Same thing with Shift D. These are just states that I designated as I don't want to look too deeply into the polls conducted there because the polls were either outdated, like conducted many months before the election, or there just weren't enough of them. I mean, in Minnesota, I think there was something like 3 major polls. Even though it's a fairly close state, there really wasn't much to go off of when analyzing the polls. And then safe or few polls. And notice this extends far beyond just safe states. Like Colorado, I wouldn't classify as safe state just yet. It didn't go to Joe Biden by a safe margin. But there, again, just the same thing as Minnesota. There were roughly 2 polls here, and it was safe enough, and the polls were inconclusive enough with big enough margins of error and so far back that I really didn't feel comfortable putting any designation on it, even something like I put on Minnesota with the shifty little polling. So, one more thing I want to hit on. This is the RCP averages, the Real Clear Politics, right? Real Clear Politics has generally been more accurate than other sources, such as 538, and its polls generally lean more conservative than other sources, such as 538. This isn't saying Real Clear Politics is a conservative organization or anything, but other organizations seem to underestimate Republicans a lot more than RCP does. Like, I'll give an example. The 538 polling average for Georgia was D plus 1.2. The RCP average for Georgia heading into Election Day, and it was Democrat throughout a lot of the month of October, but heading into Election Day, it actually favored Republicans by a tilt margin. And the Democrats won it by 0.3 points on the presidential level. But RCP actually predicted the Senate elections much more accurately because the Senate elections did swing Republican. Pennsylvania, Real Clear Politics got exactly right Again, through the month of October, Biden was leading by 3, 4, 5 points here. On election day, that final average was D plus 1.2. How the state went on election day on the presidential level. This is on the presidential level. D plus 1.2. And whereas organizations such as 538 and Politico 270 to win, they all had it up in the 5-6 point margin. They had Pennsylvania in a likely margin for Biden. So I know I've been talking for a while, but let's get straight into some states. Uh, looking first at the South, because this is really surprising. I've talked a lot in depth about how Joe Biden lost North Carolina and Florida, and exactly why, and what he did well in those states, but why he just couldn't get over the hump in states that probably lean red generically, but Joe Biden had a chance at. So, Virginia, there weren't too many polls, just enough for me to classify in the Republican category, but I wouldn't look too much into this one, although there is something to be said for that Republicans did perform a little bit better in the suburbs than expected. Same with North Carolina. North Carolina, a lot of polls there were back and forth. Biden had a small RCP lead going into Election Day. Let me check the number on that. North Carolina. Oh no, North Carolina actually heading into Election Day again. There was a big shift toward Donald Trump in a lot of these polls heading into Election Day, much like 2016 actually. Clinton was up big time, 10 points up in the Rust Belt in the month of November, in the month of October. That really swung back to Trump in November. So North Carolina, the final average for RCP was actually Trump plus 0.2. He won it by plus 1.4. South Carolina was expected to be a lot more competitive than it was. Granted, it was still decently close. It was pretty far from a safe state, like 6 points from safe. And I think there's definitely hope for Democrats here, but it definitely swung Republican, as did pretty much every state from the national polls, but the RCP polls were frankly a lot more balanced. In Florida, again, it really all comes down to the disaster for Democrats in Miami-Dade County. They did excellent across the rest of the state. Democrats, I shouldn't say Democrats. Joe Biden specifically. Joe Biden outperformed the polls in the rest of the state. He outperformed what the polls were projecting relative to, the entire state in Pinellas County, in Duval County, and really across the board, even throughout the northern panhandle and the I-4 corridor. But Miami-Dade County, again, was just such a disaster. It went something like 10 points to the right of where it went in 2016. Donald Trump won 55% of Cuban American voters, which was the biggest swing of any major demographic group in the election. So that would explain why Florida went so far further to the right, because polls really couldn't predict how Republican that specific demographic would go. And that specific demographic is really what makes or breaks Florida for the Democratic Party, regardless of how well they do across the state. Georgia, however, was an outlier because and it was really an outlier on the election. Out of Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia, Florida should have, or would have, according to many pollsters and pundits, Florida would have been the first to go blue. North Carolina is the second to go blue, and Georgia is the last one of those three big southern battleground states. So, the polls in Georgia ultimately did fairly well, but this is really just because it's not because the polls were necessarily good, considering that they got a lot of the rest of the country wrong. Not necessarily on RCP. Again, RCP was an outlier in terms of its accuracy. Just because there were major discrepancies between Georgia and states like North Carolina that were not accounted for. There was massive turnout from voters of color in Georgia that did not happen in a state like North Carolina. Those voters voted Democratic at a rate not seen in Florida, which is one of the big reasons Georgia went blue and Florida went red. Joe Biden did better in the suburbs in Georgia than he did in North Carolina. He won Cobb County by 14 points. Abrams won it by 10, and Clinton only won it by 2. So, our credit to RCP and other polling organizations for getting Georgia right, but especially RCP, because RCP, despite being further off just in terms of the sheer numbers with the D plus 0.3 final result, they were actually the best pollster or collection of polls. RCP is not a pollster. RCP collects and analyzes polls. They were the best in that regard of comparing Georgia to states like North Carolina that went Republican. Down in the Southwest, Texas was expected to be much more competitive than it was. Hawaii should be safe. New Mexico and Montana shifted Republican. New Mexico actually shifted way Republican on the Senate race. Ben Ray Lujan only won by 6 points. He was forecasted to win by something like 14 despite lack of polling. And Xochitl Torres Small unexpectedly lost her congressional reelection race in the 2nd Congressional District, which is the southern half of the state. Arizona and Nevada, I had been saying pretty much the whole election season that Nevada was going to shift blue from the polls to election day, regardless of what other states were doing, regardless of how off other polls were. Nevada always shifts blue. In 2016, really all of the states in here shifted red, all of the states up here shifted red, all the states in here shifted red. Nevada shifted blue. It's not anything specifically with the state, it's just that polling is so bad in Nevada because Clark County really dominates Nevadan politics, and I don't think that's quite taken into account for some reason or another when these polls are being done. Alaska, again, was expected to be more competitive, and it just wasn't. Same, honestly, with states like Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Indiana, even Kansas. Actually, Kansas went about as expected, but the first 5 I listed definitely went a little more Republican than expected. I just didn't feature those because they went safe. This is where the polling industry's disaster was. I mean, they might have done okay down here. They did decently in the Southwest and the Northeast, I guess. But in the Rust Belt, it was a disaster. Wisconsin RCP, again, generally had slightly more Republican polls than a lot of other outlets. RCP's average for Wisconsin was still D plus 6.7. The final result, D plus 0.7. That's 6 points. That's outside a lot of polls' margins of error. This is 2 elections in a row that pollsters have completely bungled Wisconsin. This is 2 elections in a row that Wisconsin has been completely outside of the margin of error of the majority of polls. So regardless of what they're doing in other states, pollsters really need to rethink how they're doing Wisconsin, because they're just getting it dead wrong time and time again. Iowa was expected to maybe even go in Joe Biden's column. I'm not quite sure what the polling average was, but I know for a fact it was in 2%, that this state, according to the margin of error rule, was a statistical tie, could have legitimately gone either way, and it just didn't. Donald Trump won it by 8 points, which is roughly won it by in 2016. I actually had in my last Senate forecast Teresa Greenfield edging out Joni Ernst by roughly half a point. That didn't happen either. Teresa Greenfield only ran a point or two ahead of Joe Biden statewide. And in Ohio, really the same thing. This is a state that on election night, a lot of people were looking at saying, hey, look, we've got mail-in voting just coming in, and Joe Biden's already ahead. If the suburbs hold up, Joe Biden's going to win Ohio, and by a fairly large margin, which would be really, really weird. And he just didn't. The suburbs were much more on par with North Carolina than what was happening in Michigan. And so Ohio just went, Ohio shifted very Republican from where the polls were. Very similar to Iowa. I draw great parallels both in the polls and the margins between Ohio and Iowa. Very similar situations there. Michigan, it just didn't shift as much, and Pennsylvania, D plus 1.2 is actually, it was the RCP polling average. It was exactly the margin. These were the 2 states that did narrow up, that did trend Republican going into election day. And so I think, frankly, polls were able to save face a little bit in these 2 states. But in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Ohio, we didn't see that shift in the week before election day. And so the polls stayed very Democratic compared to the result. Minnesota shifted Democratic a lot, actually, from where the polls were. But again, that's because there were only 2 or 3 good polls. So I'm not going to dive too deep into that. And then in the Northeast, Maine's 2nd Congressional District actually was expected by pretty much every outlet to go to Biden. And it went to Trump fairly handily, roughly the margin he won it by in 2016. But this is just a region that's extremely hard to poll. So frankly, I'm gonna cut the polls a little slack in here, but ultimately around the country, I would give the polls a D in terms of how they predicted the 2020 election. They ultimately were not able to accurately forecast not only the southern states' margins, but how they would go relative to each other at all. The Southwest, they were a little bit better, but Iowa, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and some of them Michigan, I saw polls with Michigan D plus 15, 16, 17, that just got bungled. So anyway, we'll see if they can rebound in 2022 and 2024. I think, frankly, those will be make or break years from a polling industry that's lost a lot of public faith already. All right, thank y'all so much for watching. I'm so sorry this video was so delayed. I know it's been a long time since I just uploaded that Georgia video, which y'all should definitely go check out. I will link that in the video and in the description. Once again, thank y'all so much. Please like, subscribe, and comment. I am on Instagram as 10-Minute Elections, all lowercase, all one word, and be looking forward to the next video. I'm telling you that state legislature video is coming. I know I've been promising it for a long time, where there will be a shout out question. Until then, see y'all and enjoy your break.